I still remember that afternoon clearly. The April sky was a pale yellow, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the glass windows of the house my husband and I had built together over 30 years. Today was my son Ethan's 29th birthday. I wanted everything to be perfect, even though lately he and I haven't had many complete conversations. The chocolate cake I had just finished decorating still had a sweet, rich smell. I carefully placed each candle, counting out 29 of them. In my hand was a small velvet box. Inside was my husband's wedding ring he passed away 4 years ago. He left everything to me, the house, the savings, and this instruction. Someday, if our son is worthy, give him this ring. It's not just gold and silver, it's trust. I thought today might be that day. Holding the ring box, I walked past the sliding glass door that opened to the backyard, where Ethan and his friends were having a party. Music and the smell of beer filled the kitchen. I intended to walk out and surprise them with the cake and gifts, but my feet stopped when I heard my son's voice. You guys know, my mom hoards all the assets my dad left behind. She controls every dime, every little thing. The best gift she could ever give me is to disappear from my life forever. I was stunned. My heart pounded erratically, as if an invisible hand was squeezing it. His friends' laughter echoed. One scoffed, another laughed loudly, as if Ethan had just said the funniest thing. But I knew it wasn't a joke. I heard the truth in every word. The son I had carried, nurtured for nearly 30 years, had openly wished for me to disappear. I quietly backed away, trying to keep the cake from falling. The kitchen grew dark, even though the party lights outside were still bright. I placed the cake on the table, next to the ring box. My fingers trembled as I touched the cold glass of the door. In that moment, I heard my husband's voice in my head. Margaret, sometimes love isn't about giving more, it's about knowing when to stop. I took a long breath, then reached for my phone. I called the police, my voice strangely calm. There are people causing a disturbance, gathering loudly, and being defiant in my house. Please come right away. An hour later, red and blue lights flashed across the garden. Ethan, who was laughing and talking, turned around, confused, then furious when he saw the police enter. He yelled, "This is my house! You have no right!" I stood in the darkness of the kitchen, watching silently. The officer replied concisely, "No, this is your mother's house, and she just asked everyone to leave." The sound of handcuffs locking onto my son's wrists was as cold as a knife cutting deep into my heart, but I didn't cry. I just stood still, watching him being escorted away, his figure unsteady in the flashing lights. The birthday party ended in a heavy silence. I gently placed my hand on the ring box. That night, I knew clearly. The only gift I could give my son was the disappearance he had asked for himself. The house was strangely empty after the police siren faded. I stood in the kitchen, the yellow light illuminating the untouched birthday cake. The whole room was like an abandoned stage after a botched performance. The chairs in the garden were still askew, empty beer cans scattered, and the smell of grilled meat lingered in the wind. But the people were all gone. Ethan's friends left the mess behind, leaving me alone with the silence. I sat down on a chair by the dining table. The table was still set with forks and knives, the tablecloth I had chosen that morning, hoping the family would have a nice meal together before blowing out the candles. Looking at it now, it resembled a soulless display in a furniture store rather than a family dining table. I asked myself, had I spoiled Ethan too much? I recalled his childhood days, how I was always ready to forgive him when he broke things, covered for him when he got into trouble on the street, and even secretly paid off a loan he took out when he was just in his early 20s. I used to think that giving him another chance was an expression of love. But tonight, his words echoed in my head like hammer strikes. "Mom, disappear from my life forever." I went up to the bedroom. The ring box still lay on the dressing table. It was the ring my husband wore for 40 years, the one he gave me on our wedding day. I touched it, a cold sensation running down my spine. I felt as if I heard him whisper, "Don't let our legacy be burned in his hands." I turned on the desk lamp and took out an old notebook. On the first page, I wrote, "Disappearance plan." I listed each line, as if it were a project I had to manage. 1. Find a real estate agent to sell the house as quickly as possible. R. Pack my belongings, only keeping what is truly necessary. 3. Cancel all bank cards, phone, and bills in my name that he is using. 4. Rewrite my will so he can't sue or cling to me later. 5. Disappear before he can get back. After writing, I closed the notebook and placed it next to the ring. Suddenly, I felt a strange peace. It wasn't serenity, but a cold, decisive feeling, like a knife handle just fitting into place. In my restless sleep that night, I dreamed of my husband standing at the end of the hallway. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with a sad but resolute expression. I understood. I had no other choice. Tomorrow morning, I would begin. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating the spacious but cold bedroom. I sat up, feeling as if a lifetime had passed since last night. The birds outside sounded more shrill than usual, and the house was so quiet I could clearly hear the ticking of the wall clock. Ethan was no longer here, but his presence seemed to be stuck in every crack in the wood, every breath of the house. I opened the wardrobe and pulled out a large, dusty suitcase. Instead of rushing, I packed carefully. A few simple dresses, sleepwear, and the thick coat my husband bought for me on our trip to Colorado that year. I left the other items behind without hesitation. I wanted to leave lightly, without carrying the invisible chains that had bound me to Ethan all these years. When I walked into his room, the smell of mildew and cigarette smoke hit me. Clothes were thrown all over the floor, empty beer cans were lined up like trophies, and the computer screen still flickered with a blue light, an unfinished game. I stood still for a moment, and an image of little Ethan from the past came to mind. The little boy who used to toddle into my arms with his teddy bear, the one who demanded I read him a story every night before bed. Where was that boy now? Buried under the layers of arrogance and selfishness that I had nurtured. I picked up an old photo, its wooden frame chipped at a corner. In the picture, my husband held Ethan on his shoulders, both smiling radiantly. I stood beside them, my arm around them, my eyes shining with the belief that this family would always be strong. I placed the photo frame back on the desk, but this time with the photo facing the wall. I couldn't bear to look at it anymore. In the kitchen, I brewed a cup of coffee. The steam rose, carrying a distinct bitter aroma, like the determination that was seeping into me. I opened the old notebook from the night before and underlined the words, "Find a real estate agent." I opened my computer and searched online. After a few clicks, I stopped at the name Anna Johnson. Her profile picture showed a professional smile, and customer reviews said, "Quick, discreet, efficient." That's exactly what I needed. I clicked to call. Her voice was clear and confident. "Hello, this is Anna Johnson. How can I help you?" I took a deep breath. "I want to sell my house, as quickly as possible. I don't want lengthy negotiations." On the other end, there was a short pause. Then Anna replied, "I understand. Can you tell me why? So I can prepare the right approach." I closed my eyes slightly. Life changes. It's time for me to leave. "Okay," Anna said, her voice no longer curious but firm. "I'll come to see the house this afternoon." Hanging up, I looked around the familiar kitchen. For years, this place had been the heart of the family evenings when my husband would take off his coat and inhale the smell of hot soup. Sunday mornings, when a little Ethan would sit on a high chair, his legs swinging, waiting for pancakes. Now it was just me, with an empty kitchen and a birthday cake that had never been blown out. I opened the plastic container and looked at the words, "Happy Birthday, Ethan," still intact. The white frosting had already hardened. I gently closed the lid, then picked up the whole cake and put it in the trash. A dry thump echoed as the box hit the bottom, as if marking the end of a naive affection I once held dear. That afternoon, Anna arrived. She walked through the house, taking photos of every corner and making meticulous notes. "The house is beautiful," she said. "If you agree, I can put it on the market right away. With the current situation, I believe we'll find a buyer in just a few days." I nodded. The sooner, the better. When I signed the agreement, my hand trembled slightly, but it wasn't out of fear. It was the tremor of an old door closing, making way for a new one. That night, I sat in the living room, looking out at the yard that used to be filled with laughter. I whispered to myself, Ethan, you wanted me to disappear. Well, this will be the last birthday gift I give you. The following days, the house was filled with a strange silence. There was no more loud music, no more of Ethan's stumbling footsteps up and down the stairs at midnight. Instead, there was only the whistling of the wind through the cracks in the door and the creaking of the wooden floor as I dragged my suitcase through each room. I spent most of my time packing. Every item, every small corner of this house was full of memories. Picking something up brought back the past. Putting it down was another act of cutting ties. In the master bedroom, I opened the nightstand drawer. An old handkerchief fell out, its edges frayed, but it still carried a faint scent of my husband. I remembered the last morning before he passed away. He held my hand, his eyes deep and profound. Margaret, you have to be strong. If one day Ethan breaks your heart, don't hold on to him with everything you have. Love has its limits. I dismissed it then, thinking he was pessimistic. But now, his words echoed more clearly than ever. I moved to the study. On the bookshelf, the novels my husband and I used to read together were still there, covered in a thick layer of dust. I ran my hand over the spines and unexpectedly opened one. Inside, he had underlined a sentence in pencil. Sometimes, for a child to find their way, parents must disappear from sight. My heart ached. Had he sensed it all? When I went down to Ethan's room, the messy scene stopped me in my tracks. I gathered the clothes and threw them into a bag, tidied up the empty cans and food boxes. But then, in a desk drawer, I found something that made my heart sink. A letter from high school. The handwriting was clumsy. Mom, I got an A in math today. I'll try harder to make you and Dad proud. I bit my lip until it bled. When did the boy write a letter like that? Why did I forget? Had I been too busy worrying, protecting, paying debts, cleaning up messes, that I forgot there used to be a light in him? I folded the letter and put it back in the drawer. I couldn't take it with me. I couldn't allow myself to be soft. Every night, I sat in the living room, listening to the clock tick away the hours. The house had been listed, and Anna called to say a few people had come to see it. Don't worry, we'll close the deal quickly, she said. I just replied, thank you. But during that waiting period, my mind was like a shattered mirror. I saw myself in different pieces. A caring mother to little Ethan, a devoted wife to my husband, and a woman who now had to stand coldly against her own flesh and blood. One night, I dreamed of little Ethan, sitting at the foot of my bed, looking at me with big, round eyes. Mom, you'll never leave me, will you? In the dream, I nodded and hugged him tightly. But when I woke up, my pillow was wet with tears, and in my heart was a different answer. Son, sometimes I have to leave, so you can learn to stand on your own. On the 7th day, Anna called again. Mrs. Margaret, I have a family who really loves the house. They want to buy it immediately, paying in cash. If you agree, we can sign in a few days. I gripped the phone tightly. A rush of memories flooded back the day my husband first led me through this door. The day I brought newborn Ethan home from the hospital. The day we celebrated his 10th birthday in the backyard, with balloons filling the sky. Everything was about to become the past. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice calm. Close the deal, Anna. I want it done as soon as possible. When I put the phone down, I felt as if an invisible thread had just snapped. I had taken another step, and there was no turning back. On the day of the transfer, it was drizzling. I sat in the notary's office, my hand trembling slightly as I made the final signature. The papers were closed, and with them, 30 years of memories were also closed, behind the heavy wooden door of the old house. On the way home, I drove slowly, looking in the rearview mirror. The sky was a dull gray, and raindrops tapped a rhythm on the glass. I thought, maybe the heavens also understood that this was no ordinary day. The house suddenly became a strange place the moment I stepped in. The walls were the same, the furniture was the same, but I knew, from this moment on, it no longer belonged to me. The new owners would come, they would change the arrangement, sweep away our traces, and I only had one last night to say goodbye. I went from room to room, as if saying goodbye to each piece of memory. The living room, where my husband and I used to sit and watch the evening news. I closed my eyes, imagining he was still on the familiar sofa, a cup of hot tea in his hand. The kitchen, where I used to cook family meals. I gently ran my hand over the scratched wooden table, remembering the days when little Ethan would play with spoons and forks here. The stairs, where he used to run down on Christmas morning, shouting with joy when he saw the gift boxes under the tree. Finally, I entered his room. It was still a mess, although I had cleaned up most of it. The room had an unpleasant, stale smell, but I forced myself to sit on the bed. I needed to feel everything, so I would have no regrets later. In the silence, I took out the notebook and opened a new page. I knew it was time to write the last words for Ethan. My hand trembled, but the words slowly appeared. Ethan, you once said the best gift I could give you was to disappear from your life. So I will do exactly as you asked. This house has been sold. From now on, you have to take care of money, convenience, and a home, all by yourself. I am no longer a crutch for you to spend, nor a shield to protect you whenever you cause trouble. I still love you, but this love will no longer take the form of spoiling. It is an absence, so you can learn how to exist. If one day you truly change, I believe we can meet again. But don't expect me to open the door and welcome you with open arms like before. Remember, you chose this gift yourself. I put the pen down, tears blurring a corner of the words. I folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and wrote his name on it. Ethan. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch, listening to the rain fall on the roof. In the darkness, I imagined my husband sitting beside me, silent as he was when he was alive. I whispered to the empty space, Honey, I did as you instructed. There was no other way. If you were still here, you would probably do this for me. The wind blew hard, carrying the smell of wet earth. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the sense of emptiness spreading within me. The next morning, I pulled 3 suitcases to the door and locked it for the last time. The click of the lock echoed dryly, like a final period. I left the envelope on the kitchen table, right where Ethan would surely see it first. Then I walked away, carrying a heavy pain, but also a sense of liberation. I stopped by Mr. End and the Persons, Colin's house, my longtime neighbor, to drop off the keys and a few messages. He just nodded slightly, not asking any more questions. From his second-floor window, I looked over at my old house. The sun had just risen, casting a warm light on the windows. The house was no longer mine, but inside, there was still a small envelope containing the biggest decision of my life. In a few days, Ethan would return from the county jail. And for the first time in his life, he would have to face the truth. His mother had disappeared exactly as he had wished. 14 days passed more quickly than I expected. During that time, I lived quietly at Mr. Collins' house, only occasionally opening the curtains to look at my old house. The sold sign was planted in the front yard. The new owners would be moving in soon. Every time I saw it, I felt both pain and relief, like a wound beginning to scab over. That morning, just as the sun rose, I heard the sound of a police car driving down the street. My heart clenched for a moment. I knew Ethan had been released. Around noon, I watched from the second-floor window. His familiar figure appeared at the end of the street, his shoulders hunched in a worn jacket, a small plastic bag in his hand. He walked with a tired demeanor, no longer with the arrogant, proud gait he had at the birthday party. Ethan stopped in front of the gate. He stared at the sold sign, then turned to the front door. His hand trembled as he tried the key, but the lock had been changed. He knocked on the door and shouted, "Mom, are you in there?" Silence. He knocked harder, his voice sharp. "Don't play these games. Mom, open the door." But the door remained silently closed. The new neighbors hadn't moved in yet, so the whole house was like an empty shell. Ethan slumped down on the steps, his hands clutching his head. I watched from afar, seeing his shoulders shake. I didn't know if it was anger or despair. A moment later, he stood up, walked around, and suddenly saw the envelope I had left on the kitchen table through the glass door. He peered closer, recognizing his name on it. Just a few minutes later, somehow he managed to get inside. Maybe the back window wasn't locked tightly. He came out with the envelope in his hand, tearing it open in a hurry. I couldn't hear every word, but I knew he was reading the lines I had written with tears. When he finished reading, he stood motionless for a long time. His face turned pale, then red with anger. He crumpled the letter into a ball, threw it on the ground, and screamed into the empty street. "You really abandoned me?" The scream echoed, then faded into the wind. I pulled the curtain closed, my heart heavy. Ethan had begun to taste the emptiness I had prepared for him. This was just the beginning. Ethan left the house that afternoon, his footsteps unsteady like someone who had lost his way. I silently followed him from Mr. Collins' window. He never looked back, not knowing that a pair of eyes was still watching him. The plastic bag in his hand only contained a few old clothes and some change. All the bank cards and credit cards I had canceled beforehand. Everything he was used to, the car, the phone, the accounts his father left behind, no longer belonged to him. At first, Ethan went to a few close friends he used to hang out with. I saw him knock on the door of a guy named Jared, the one who laughed along when he said I should disappear. The door opened, and Jared stood there, a beer bottle still in his hand. They talked for a few moments, then Jared shook his head. I guessed it. He refused to let Ethan stay. That night, Ethan slept on a bench in a park a few blocks away from the house. I saw him huddled under the streetlight, his face buried in his arms. For the first time in his life, he tasted what it was like to be without a roof over his head. The next day, he went to his girlfriend, a young woman named Melissa. I had met her a few times and knew her eyes weren't really on Ethan, but on the trips, parties, and gifts he used to squander. The scene unfolded just as I had predicted. She returned the bracelet Ethan had given her, then turned and walked away. Ethan ran after her, grabbing her arm, but she just shoved him away, coldly saying a few words. I couldn't hear what she said, but seeing him collapse in the middle of the street was enough. For 3 days, Ethan wandered around. He went to the bar where he used to spend money like water, hoping to get a job as a waiter. But the manager just smirked. "You used to throw bottles at the wall and get into fights here. I'd rather hire anyone else off the street." Ethan tried a small grocery store. I saw him standing outside, talking to the owner, then being shooed away. He looked like a lost child, his jacket dirty, his shoes worn out. I knew, in his head, he must have been screaming, "Why did Mom abandon me?" But the truth was, if I didn't abandon him, he would never know what it was like to shoulder life's burdens. On the 5th night, it rained heavily. I saw Ethan taking shelter on the park bench again. He was soaked, his hair matted to his face. He sat there in a daze, watching the rainwater carry trash down the street. That sight made my heart ache. I wanted to run to him, give him an umbrella, a blanket, but I held back. In the darkness, I whispered, as if talking to my husband, "Honey, he's starting to learn the lesson we could never teach him our whole lives. But oh my God, it hurts so much." Ethan had stepped into the first days of a life without a safety net, and that was just the beginning of his awakening. A week had passed since Ethan returned. I was still watching him from afar, sometimes walking past the park, pretending to be a stranger, sometimes looking from Mr. Collins's window. I saw him becoming more and more haggard, his jacket stained with mud, his eyes sunken, his beard scruffy. On the morning of the 8th day, he went to a construction site in the suburbs. I stood far away, seeing him talk to a manager, his face pleading. Perhaps Ethan was begging for a manual labor job. The manager looked at him from head to toe, shrugged, then handed him a shovel. That was the first time I saw Ethan truly work. He shoveled sand, carried bricks, and sweat poured down his face. At first, he worked reluctantly, his arms trembling, his breath short. But then, perhaps because of the gnawing hunger in his stomach, he stayed for an extra hour. In the afternoon, I saw him crouched behind a wall, quickly chewing a piece of bread that the contractor must have given him. His face was dirty, and his hands were bleeding from blisters. For the first time, I saw in his eyes not anger, not defiance, but the genuine fatigue of a person struggling to survive. The next day, he came back, but in the middle of the day, while carrying a bag of cement, his legs gave way. I heard a worker yell, "Look out! The bag's falling!" Ethan fell face down on the ground, a cloud of dust rising. The bag of cement rolled down, pressing on one of his shoulders. The manager shouted, and a few workers ran over to pull the bag off. Ethan lay there, panting, his face pale, his lips trembling. I stood a short distance away, my heart clenching. I wanted to rush over, help him up, and hug him. But I stood still, my hands clenched until they bled. I knew this was a crisis he had to face on his own. The manager waved his hand. "You're not cut out for this. Go on, I don't want any trouble." Ethan staggered to his feet, holding his shoulder, and slowly walked out of the construction site. I followed from a distance, seeing him enter a small alley and slump down on the wet pavement. He buried his face in his bleeding hands, then burst into tears, no longer the angry screams, but the shattered sobs of a lost child. For the first time, I saw my son cry like a baby. In that moment, I understood that what he had just gone through had deeply etched a lesson into his heart, that life doesn't show favoritism and no one can live forever by depending on others. That evening, I saw Ethan hobble to a small church on the street. He didn't go inside, just sat on the steps, looking at the yellow light from the stained glass windows. His face was haggard, but his eyes for the first time were not just full of hatred, but something like regret. I turned and walked away, tears streaming down my cheeks. Perhaps the moment he collapsed was the starting point of his awakening. After that night, sitting in a daze on the church steps, Ethan began to wander the neighborhood with a different look in his eyes. I watched him quietly, realizing he was no longer looking for friends, no longer clinging to the familiar bars, and no longer knocking on the doors of houses that once held superficial laughter. Perhaps he understood there was no one left to welcome him with open arms. On the 15th day after his release from prison, Ethan went to a small eatery on the corner of the street. It was a place owned by an elderly couple. I used to stop by for coffee when I lived in the old house. I saw him stand outside for a long time, his hand hovering over the doorknob, his eyes hesitant. Finally, he went inside. Through the misty glass, I saw the owner, Mr. Harris, frowning when he saw him. But instead of immediately throwing him out, he crossed his arms and listened. Ethan bowed his head, his shoulders trembling, his lips moving as if begging. "Mr. Harris looked at him for a long time, then sighed and pointed to an apron hanging on a hook. I felt like I was holding my breath. Ethan tremblingly took it and quickly tied it around his waist. So for the first time, he had a real job washing dishes, wiping tables, taking out the trash. That evening, I sat in a far corner, pretending to be a customer. I watched Ethan bend over, carrying stacks of plates, his chapped hands bright red from the cold dishwater. Each time Mr. Harris gave him a reminder, he just nodded, without arguing or getting annoyed. On his tired face, for the first time, I saw patience. In the following days, he continued to come back. At first, he only received a small wage and a simple meal. But I saw him eat heartily, without complaining or leaving food unfinished like before. A bowl of hot soup, a piece of dry bread, was a great comfort to him now. Once, I caught him at the sink, looking at his calloused hands. He touched a crack on his skin, then gave a faint laugh to himself, a bitter laugh, yet one of understanding. In the evening, when the shop closed, I saw him stay to wipe the tables for a long time, the yellow light casting a long shadow over his skinny figure. Outside, it was cold, and the wind was blowing through the cracks in the door. But perhaps, inside him, there was a little warmth, not from money, but from the effort put in to earn a decent meal. I watched my son, my heart both aching and filled with a fragile hope. Maybe, after so many years of being lost, Ethan was finally finding his way. That night, I wrote in my diary, "He's willing to work. Maybe you were right, honey. Only when he no longer has a mother to lean on can he learn to stand up on his own." That afternoon, I walked past the small eatery owned by Mr. and Mrs. Harris. As usual, I walked slowly, pretending to just be taking a stroll, but my eyes never left the shop door. Through the glass, I saw Ethan bent over, carrying a tray of dishes, his movements careful, his face dotted with sweat. Suddenly, the door opened. A customer stepped out, allowing Ethan to look directly outside. In that moment, his eyes scanned the crowd on the sidewalk and stopped on me. I froze, my heart pounding. Ethan's eyes briefly flared up, like a flash of lightning tearing through the night. He quickly put the tray on the counter, his hands trembling. For a second, I thought he would rush out and call my name. But he stood still, his hands tightly gripping the edge of his apron, his lips moving without making a sound. His face was torn between joy, anger, and shame. As for me, I turned away. My steps were heavy, but I forced myself to walk, to maintain the right distance. I knew that if I turned back and hugged him, all the challenging days would vanish. He would lean on me again, just like he had for so many years. Behind me, I heard a faint sound, the door of the shop opening, then stopping. I knew Ethan had intended to run after me, but in the end, he didn't dare. Perhaps he understood. Seeing his mother in this state, with chapped hands and an apron stained with dishwater, was a shame he wasn't ready to face. I walked further away, tears streaming down my face. In my chest, my heart was both in pain and relieved. I had seen with my own eyes that my son was learning how to live, and more importantly, I saw him gradually learning to bow his head to the truth. That night, when I returned to Mr. Collins' house, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. My face clearly showed fatigue, but in my eyes, for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. I whispered, "Ethan, you've seen me, but you can't reach me yet. Only when you truly change, when you understand the value of life, will I let you get close again." In the days that followed, Ethan continued to work at the small eatery. From afar, I watched, seeing that he was no longer the haggard vagrant in the park. Although he was thin and his face was gaunt, there was something different about him. Focus, patience, and a quiet maturity. One rainy afternoon, when the shop was empty, Ethan was told to take out the trash in the back. I quietly followed from a distance, hiding under an awning. In the alley behind the shop, he came across a boy about 10 years old, his thin shirt soaked with rainwater, fumbling to pick up empty bottles from the trash can. The boy was trembling, his hands dirty, and his eyes were scared when he saw Ethan. For a moment, I was afraid Ethan would yell or chase him away, the way he used to treat the vulnerable when he was arrogant. But no, Ethan just stood still for a few seconds, then slowly took off his soaking wet jacket and draped it over the boy's shoulders. "It's cold, put this on," he said softly, his voice hoarse. The boy looked at him in surprise, his eyes shining with a rare trust. Ethan took a few dollars from his pocket, his meager wages, and pressed them into the boy's hand. "Take this. Buy some bread. Don't pick through the trash anymore, you'll get sick." I stood frozen, my heart clenching. Ethan, the son, who once spent thousands of dollars on meaningless parties, now knew how to give a few meager dollars to help a stranger. When the boy ran off, Ethan sat down on the steps and looked up at the rainy sky. He buried his face in his hands, as if thinking about himself. Perhaps in the image of the boy, he saw a reflection of himself, lonely, lost, with no one to shelter him. I turned away, walking in the rain, my tears mixing with the cold drops. I didn't need to see any more, because that moment was enough. My son was truly changing. That night, in my diary, I wrote, "He knew how to reach out and help someone else. Maybe it's time for me to believe that Ethan can turn his life around." That night, after the eatery closed, I saw Ethan not heading straight for the park as usual. He turned onto a small road and sat down on the steps in front of the church, the same place where he had sat silently for hours before. I followed, walking slowly, my heart pounding as if it wanted to burst out of my chest. Ethan looked up at the brightly lit stained glass window, his eyes red and swollen, then whispered softly, his voice almost choked, "If you were still here, I just want to say, I'm sorry." I stood a few steps away, my trembling hands clutching the hem of my coat. In that moment, I knew I couldn't hide any longer. I stepped out of the darkness, the sound of my heels echoing on the wet pavement. Ethan started and turned around. When he saw me, his face was stunned, his lips trembling. Mom!" He stood up abruptly, his eyes wide, filled with both joy and regret. I saw his whole body tremble, as if he was afraid that if he touched me, my figure would vanish. I walked closer, the church light casting our shadows together. I looked directly into his eyes, which were hardened by hardship, and whispered, "Son, you finally learned how to say sorry." Ethan burst into tears. He knelt down right in front of me, his hands clutching the hem of my dress like a lost child who had just found his mother. "Mom, forgive me. I was wrong. So wrong." I placed my hand on his shoulder, my hand trembling, but full of warmth. My own tears streamed down my face, mixing with his sobs. I didn't say the word forgive right away, just whispered, "You've learned what your father wanted you to understand. That is the real gift." Ethan looked up, his eyes teary, but a strange light. A light of maturity I had never seen before flashed within them. We hugged each other tightly, in the rainy night, under the yellow light of the church. There was no more anger, no more distance, only two people, a mother, a son who had gone through pain together to find each other again. That night, I knew, the arduous journey had ended, and a new life with hope, responsibility, and love was beginning to open up. After that reunion night, I took Ethan back to the small room I had temporarily rented. He was hesitant, afraid, as if he still couldn't believe he was allowed to walk with me. But when I opened the door and gave a slight nod, he stepped inside with an expression full of gratitude. In the following days, I no longer protected him as I had before. I let Ethan wake up early to go to work at the eatery, to manage his meager wages on his own. I only occasionally asked how he was, or cooked him a simple meal when he was too tired. And I saw in his eyes a change every day, less arrogant, more quiet, less demanding, more grateful. One evening, as we sat eating at the small wooden table, Ethan put down his chopsticks and looked at me for a long time. His voice was hoarse. "Mom, I know Dad left you all the assets. I used to hate it because I thought I was abandoned. But now I understand. I didn't deserve what Dad earned. I just want a chance to start over, to make you and Dad proud, even if I have nothing in my hands." I was speechless. In his eyes, for the first time, I saw the image of a grown man, not a spoiled boy, but a person who truly knew how to accept responsibility. I placed my hand on his and smiled gently through my tears. "Ethan, you don't have to make your father or me proud with money. As long as you live a decent life and appreciate hard work and love, your father will be smiling somewhere too." He bowed his head, tears streaming down, but a tired smile still appeared on his lips. Time went on. Ethan continued to work at the eatery and was gradually trusted with more responsibilities. He wasn't rich, but he knew how to cherish every dollar he earned. And more importantly, he learned how to care for others, just like the day he gave the homeless boy his wet jacket. As for me, every time I saw my son in his simple work clothes, I knew I had done the right thing. It was painful, cruel, but it was right. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow on the rooftops, Ethan turned to me and asked, "Mom, why did you disappear and then come back?" I was silent for a long time. Then I answered, "Because only when I disappeared could you learn to see yourself. And when you found yourself again, I could come back." Ethan nodded, his eyes welling up with tears. He didn't ask anything else, just sat quietly beside me. In that moment, I knew the final lesson had been etched into his heart, a lesson no school could teach, but could only be learned through loss, pain, and the unconditional love of a mother. And that's how the story ended. A mother chose to walk away to save her wayward son. A son, after hitting rock bottom, finally found the path to becoming a decent person. There was no longer a need for wealth, no more need for extravagant parties. All that was left was a mother's love, the only thing strong enough to transform a lost soul into a new human being.